Hi, everyone. So, as some of you know, I am going back to much earlier episodes and editing them into videos. So, this is one of my earlier episodes, Near Death Experiences, NDEs, with Dr. Janice Holden, episode 17. In the earlier episodes, I never had any intention of publishing videos. So you're going to have to excuse me for not looking super video ready. And in the middle of the episode, it went from afternoon to evening. So the lighting changed on my end, but I did the best I could. Co-hosting this episode with Darren McEnaney of Seeking I. And now here is episode 17.
Hey everyone!
I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the title. Welcome to What the F Just Happened? I'm your host, Liz Enton. If you listened to the intro, you know my story. If not, here's a brief summary. I'm a sciencey skeptic, and when my dad died, I took a shot in the dark and decided to investigate if there was any possible evidence of an afterlife. I assumed that was as realistic as Santa Claus, but I was desperate. However, I was so blown away by what I discovered that I wrote a book and launched this podcast. In this podcast, I'll be talking to some fairly normal people about some really weird stuff. I speak with everyone from psychic mediums and afterlife researchers to ordinary people who've had some inexplicable experiences. So come, listen. There's no need to draw any final conclusions. Keep an open mind and wonder, what the F just happened? Hi guys, I am back again with Darren McEnaney doing an interview and talk with someone I'm so excited to have on. She made such a difference. She was very key in the early stage of my research, and when I was just huddled up in bed in deep grief and desperate for hope that there was something more. This is Dr. Janice Holden, and she is president of IANDS, International Association for Near-Death Studies. She is also very logical, grounded, someone you can really trust her judgment. She is a professor of counseling at University of North Texas. She has a degree in psychology and used to teach psychology, and as well had a private practice. And Dr. Holden, if there's anything I left out, you can introduce yourself better than I can. So also go ahead and give everyone an introduction.
You did a great job, Liz. Actually, technically, my degree is in counselor education, and I was a counselor educator for 31 years at UNT, as you said, before I retired in 2019. So now I'm a professor emerita.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for coming on. So I think we should start by explaining what exactly is a near-death experience, also called an NDE.
Mm-hmm. Well, my definition, and different researchers have different definitions. And some years ago, the person I consider the leading researcher in the field is Bruce Grayson, psychiatrist from the University of Virginia, also recently retired. And he tried to get us all together to agree on a definition, and he couldn't wrangle these cats, so or herd these cats. So my definition is that in although this experience happens most often when a person is either actually close to death, is in the threat of death, or is actually in the first few moments of death with like cardiac arrest. The experience actually occurs in any of a variety of extreme circumstances. So a person might have this experience when they're extremely grieved. They might have it when they're in the extreme of physical exertion, running a 50K race. They might have it in the extreme condition of rage, or in the extreme equanimity of deep meditation. And there's research to indicate that the circumstance, no matter what the circumstances, the experience still has these certain qualities. So what the experience is it can have an either or both of two aspects. And the first aspect is an out-of-body experience, or what I call the material aspect, because the person perceives himself to be out of their body, watching or perceiving the material world. They see, they hear what's going on, and perception in this state is normal plus. So things look normal as they would from the body, but the person also has additional visual abilities, like the ability to see in any direction that they send their attention to, up, down, back, front, right, left. They have the ability to move through solid materials such as walls, and they can speed happens at the thought happens at the speed of thought. So a person thinks something and boom, it happens. And so if the person is in this material condition, and usually the person, their sense of self is above the physical body, although it can also be away from the physical body, but most often, at least at the beginning, people perceive themselves to be above their physical body. If they think, I wonder what my parents are doing in the waiting room, waiting for me while I'm in surgery. Phew, the person's right there seeing the parents. And so then the other aspect is what I call the transmaterial aspect, because the person has the perception usually of literally moving beyond the material world into a transmaterial domain. There might be a transition, such as moving through a tunnel, an enclosure, or just moving rapidly through space, but they end up in this location that is not of the material world, where they encounter non-material entities like deceased loved ones, spirit guides, angels, sometimes recognizable religious figures, other times a sense of being having a very familiar relationship with this spiritual being, but not being able to identify them specifically. So that's it. It's this experience that can include a material aspect, a transmaterial aspect, or both. Usually the material happens first, then the transmaterial, but sometimes somebody will have only one or the other. Sometimes they'll occur even in reverse order. Sometimes they even overlap, like someone seeing spiritual entities in the operating room. while their body is in cardiac arrest. And so you've got both the material of the operating room and the transmaterial of these spiritual entities that are not of the material world. So it can be
the operating room, they wouldn't just see the room as if they were in their body. They'd see it, and they'd see as if they were looking at themselves above themselves, right. And hearing what the doctors were saying and seeing spiritual beings.
Right, that's right.
I think for you, Dr. Holden, if I'm right, your main kind of area of interest is that material part of it, the veridical perception as it's known. That's kind of one of your main...
Yeah, actually, so veridical perception, which is, you're so right, Darren, this is really probably my primary interest related to near-death experiences for reasons we can get into, but veridical perception is where a person receives information during the near-death experience that, based on the condition and position of their physical body, they shouldn't be able to know, and yet is later verified as accurate. And particularly in cases where the information is completely unexpected or even contradicts what the person would assume, and it's the information they gained is verified by a credible third party, like usually it's a physician who was there when a person went into cardiac arrest, that's all found to be accurate. And most of the cases involve the material world, but actually some cases involve the transmaterial domain as well. As an example, someone might have a near-death experience, come back and regain consciousness and report to their family that's around them that they met such and such a relative who was deceased. But as far as everybody there knows, that person is alive and well. Somebody just talked to them yesterday. And then a couple hours later, they get a phone call letting them know that this person had died suddenly of a heart attack several hours before. So at the time of the near-death experience, that person really was dead. The near-death experiencer was the first to learn through their NDE. So there are things that can happen in the transmaterial domain that are also critical.
And that's the so-called peak and Deran experience, isn't it?
Yeah, what has been called peak and Deran, which is a term that really kind of doesn't make sense, but it's been renamed something like perception of people not known to have died. Perception of people not known to have died.
I like that one better than peak and Deran. It's clearer. And just to clarify, these are people who died where it was completely unexpected. It wasn't, someone's great grandmother who was elderly. It wasn't someone who'd been struggling with a disease. It would be like a 30-year-old who died in a healthy 30-year-old who died in a car accident.
That's right. Yeah. It will like an example would be a little boy who was hospitalized, and in his NDE, he saw his older sister, who everybody knew was away at college and healthy. And the parents, because they were at the hospital, they were out of reach of the college. And when they got home a few hours later, they found all these messages on their answering machine. The college had been trying to reach them because their daughter had died in a car accident a few hours before the son's near-death experience. So again, he was right. She had passed, and nobody knew it at the time that he perceived it. Nobody in the vicinity.
Which is so amazing. I actually want to ask you, because it's such an interesting field of study, what got you into studying NDEs?
Well, there isn't just one thing. If I go all the way back, I've just always been interested in phenomena that are difficult to explain. And I read about psychic phenomena even as a preteen. In high school, I read about Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet who could diagnose illnesses of people that he never met, that lived, hundreds of miles away, who had these rare, like difficult to diagnose things, and he would go into a trance and diagnose them, and then they would end up getting life-saving treatment and stuff like that. I read about mysticism, or at least I tried to in high school. And then when I was, I believe it was between my freshman and sophomore year of college, my father read a book called The Great Soul Trial. And it's a nonfiction book about a reclusive miner from Arizona. This is back around like 1960. And he went off to mine in the mountains as he did routinely, but he never came back. And long story short, the state of Arizona opened his safe deposit box when they presumed him dead and found several $100,000 and a note that he wanted the money, handwritten note. He wanted the money used for research on the survival of consciousness after death. So the state of Arizona put a little notice in the paper and thought nobody would pay attention, but to their surprise, over 100 individuals and organizations came forward to try to claim the money. So the state actually had to hold a trial where a judge heard each of these people testify how they would use the money to fulfill the wishes of this guy. His name was James Kidd. And the book, The Great Soul Trial, is mostly the transcripts from the trial. And so I read about the research director of the American Society for Psychical Research, the research director from the American Psychical Association, talking about how they would do this research. So it was an introduction into the scientific investigation of these phenomena that are not easy to investigate, not easy to research. And then, so that was probably around 1970. And then in 1978, I read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, which is the first book that it's really considered now to have opened the contemporary field of near-death studies. And it's in that book that Moody coined the term near-death experience and described many cases of this. And then fast forward another 7 years, and I'm working on my doctoral dissertation in counseling at a program that had courses, like one course was titled Transpersonal Perspective in Education and Counseling. And we studied things like near-death experiences, psychic phenomena, Stanislav Grof's discoveries from LSD research about the realms of the human unconscious moving into domains beyond the material and so forth. And I was trying to find a topic for my dissertation, and I tried like 5 different things, all of which aborted at some point. And finally, I decided to try something related to near-death experiences, and that's the one that went through and enabled me to finish my degree. And by the time I finished that study, I was just absolutely hooked on research on NDEs and there are a lot of related phenomena that occur during NDEs that I've also gotten into research on, such as after-death communication. So that's how I got into it.
It's rare you hear people who got into it so young. I mean, you've had a whole lifetime of this. I love that. So, Darren, I know I asked the last question. Do you want to ask? Do you have more? I have a trillion questions, so I don't want to dominate.
You go ahead. Me and Jan we've been working together for quite a while now on CKNI projects and some IANDS projects as well. So I know quite a lot about Jan's research. So I'll let you go ahead. Okay. I'll just chime in when something interesting comes up that might be worth expanding on.
Maybe I can jump in here and say that this phenomenon of veridical perception is documented now in a book called The Self Does Not Die. And it contains over 100 cases of verified paranormal phenomena associated with NDEs. And as I said, in most cases verified by physicians or surgeons who were working with a person during a medical crisis. So they're very credible. And even I, who had actually provided the data set that was the foundation for this book, when I actually finished editing, I served as editor of the book and just read it through. It was amazing to me to read one case after another from these physicians from all over the world, who not only have no reason to falsify, what they experienced, but actually have incentive not to report what they've experienced, because by and large, the medical community is still very philosophically materialist, thinking everything as Deran so aptly says, the mind is what the brain does. And so these cases where people are having perceptions of things that cannot be explained in terms of our current materialist understanding of the working of the senses, the brain, rationality, and all that. It exceeds all that. It's very impactful to read these cases one after another.
And it's certainly a very important book, because when you think of near-death experiences, generally you think of the well-media publicised ones like the Eben Alexanders, the Anita Morjanis, and people like that, but you don't realise how many of these take place in a veridical form that aren't really blown up on the media. I suppose if I could just raise an important point, Jan, your opinion on it, what would you say to those who are more materialistic minded or maybe aren't familiar with the research, when they would say that, well, it might be interesting stories, but that's all they are. They're anecdotes in a book form, which isn't really much use.
Yeah. Well, that's the value of having cases. We refer to them as cases rather than anecdotes, because they've all been investigated and shown to be verified. And so when, as Bruce Grayson points out, all research begins with cases. And so when cases come together to show some kind of pattern, then you have, a very, it gets your attention. And since then, there's been extensive research on NDEs and their after effects involving thousands of people from all over the world. So the experience and its after effects are irrefutable. The veridical aspects are less common than NDEs in general, but the fact that they are there are over 100 cases, and that book is about to be revised, and they're adding 10 or 15 more cases that have come to light since the book was published, I think in 2014 or something like that. This is what science is. It's the collection of cases, investigating them, trying to show if there's any way to explain them other than that somehow consciousness was exceeding the function of the brain.
You said the after effects are very consistent among people. Can you explain some of the after effects?
Sure. Well, I like to, they're extensive, and so I like to categorize them as PSPS, just like after a letter, you would write a PS. This is after an NDE. These are the after effects. And first is psychological. And the most extensive finding is that virtually everyone who's had a near-death experience, and by the way, out of all the people who, for example, survive a close brush with death, research indicates that 80 to 90% of people won't remember anything unusual, but 10 to 20% will remember a near-death experience. So for most people, they get hit by a car, they lose consciousness, and then they wake up hours or days later in the hospital, don't remember anything unusual. But for 10 to 20%, they'll wake up or regain normal consciousness and report that during the time that their body was unconscious, they had this experience of being, in the material or transmaterial domains, but functioning apart from their physical body. So it's important to realize that this, how like often or not often this happens. But for those who have had a near-death experience, the most widely verified after effect is that people lose their fear of death. They have absolutely no fear because they've experienced it as they believe, and they know that there's nothing to fear. That, as one person said, it's like walking from this room into the next room. It's just like that. And now they might still fear, a long suffering path toward death. Nobody wants that, but death itself holds no fear for them. And then they also become, we're talking here about psychological changes. Their values change. They become less materialistic, more concerned about other people, concerned about the planet, animals. Some NDEs just can't stand to even kill a fly anymore because they have this profound empathy with other, and they just know that consciousness is precious. And so those are some of the psychological changes. And then there are spiritual changes. People become more interested in spirituality. It might take the form of religion, but usually not. Usually people become more spiritual and less religious. And that doesn't mean that NDEs aren't sometimes still religious or involved in their religion. They are, but there's a tendency to move away from religion because religion wasn't big enough to explain what they experienced. Also, some after effects that might be considered spiritual is people develop psychic abilities. They see the future. They have profound empathy for other people such that they know what's going on in another person's life just by being near them or thinking about them. And sometimes people develop healing abilities. Like a lot of NDEs experience that they have energy in their hands, and that they can use their hands to help physical healing. So those kinds of spiritual things, and a lot of NDEs feel like they've now have like one foot in the material world and one foot in the transmaterial or spiritual domain. That it's part of their consciousness is still there, and so it's kind of like the person who's walking along and their feet are on the ground. That's the material domain, but their head is in the clouds. That's the spiritual domain. So, and then there are physical after effects, and these include people have changes in their metabolism. They become a lot of times more sensitive to medication, to allergens in the environment, and things like that. Sometimes they report needing less sleep and even needing less food. Sometimes they'll have changes in their diet where they may want to not eat meat anymore, partly for that consciousness thing about animals. But on the other hand, I have an NDE friend who has to have meat every day or she doesn't feel right. So none of these things are like true for every single person. They're trends or tendencies or likelihoods for people. And one of the interesting after effects, physical after effects, is electromagnetic. That this has been studied scientifically by more than one research group, that NDEs report, and their intimates, the people around them, like spouses, children, parents, and that sort of thing report as well, that in the vicinity of the near-death experiencer, electrical things go wonky. They misact. They break down. Last week, I met a gal who happens to be local, who realized that a memory she had, two memories she had actually from her life, one from when she nearly drowned as a 2-year-old, and one from when she had heart surgery as an adult, were actually near-death experiences. And it came as something of a shock to her, like she had always just not known what to do with these memories or put them away. And then something happened, and she started reading about NDEs and realized that this applied to her. So she found me and contacted me, and we met at Starbucks. And after we talked quite a bit about the things that she needed to digest, her newfound sense of herself, I asked her, "Are you wearing a watch?" And she said, "No." She said, I don't know what it is. I just can't wear a watch. Every time I wear it, the battery dies. I replace the battery. It dies again within a week. I replace it again. She said, I've given up. And she said, and in fact, we're going to, she said, there are a lot of I laughed and I said, this is an NDE thing. And she's like, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, this is a known thing that," I said, "when I go to the IANDS conference and I'm meeting somebody new, I'll glance down at their wrist to see if they're wearing a watch. And that's my first clue as to whether they're a near-death experiencer or somebody who's there out of interest but hasn't actually had an NDE." And she said, "Oh gosh," she said, "I have all kinds of electrical problems at my house." And she said, "We're about to move because we think there's something fundamentally wrong with the electronics." And I said, "Don't move because it's you, babe. It's when you move, you're going to have trouble at that location." And she has a lot of anxiety that's related to things unrelated to her NDE. And I said to her, "The fact that you have rather high anxiety probably exacerbates the problem, because we know from research that when people become emotionally aroused, that's when things start going, light bulbs start flickering or explode, and computers crash and you lose your cell phone call, and all those kinds of things happen." So NDEers who are savvy about this learn that if they're having something like that, they need to move away from their computer, get quiet, get into a place of equanimity, and then come back and they'll be able to function okay. So that's physical. So anyway, now I've talked about psychological, spiritual, physical, and the last S is social, because you can imagine that if somebody's having all these changes, they essentially come back from a near-death experience transformed. They are transformed in the experience. So they come back in many cases feeling like a somewhat different person. And this is going to have reverberations in their social lives. So if someone has had a near-death experience and the experiencer is married, there's a much higher than usual likelihood that they'll get divorced, not because of conflict or that sort of thing, but we know that it's because the value changes happen. And if usually when two people marry, they have relatively similar values. Well, if one person has an NDE and their values diverge from their partner, those people are likely to divorce. And there are a few cases where the partner that didn't have the NDE started off with more NDE-like values. So when their spouse has an NDE and their values converge, those marriages continue happier than ever. So, but you can imagine if this happens with parents and children.
Hi! So, exciting news. Book number 2, WTF just happened? A sciencey skeptic investigates even more evidence of an afterlife and fights for justice with her dead dog. Is ready. You can get it everywhere in both ebook and paper. This book essentially picks up where WTF Part 1 left off. I continue to experience a bunch of what the fuckery, and it's a bit different now because I know the mediums pretty well, so I get some actual opinions on what they thought of me when they first met me. I get more crazy signs, and the evidence just keeps accumulating. I keep bugging my dad for that one sign I really, really wanted, and some really crazy stuff happens related to that. I conduct experiments with psychic medium Joe Peretta, and again, bunch of what the fuckery. And in a really weird twist, I get called as a secondary witness to testify in the Harvey Weinstein case, which is a secondary plot. And that results in my dog, Peanut, who is on the other side and sending me some signs, ends up becoming famous. So if you want to keep hearing about scientific evidence of an afterlife and this really bizarre side story, you can go order my second book in the series. I love getting to say it that now. WTF Just Happens, actually a series. So you can go to my website, and that links to everywhere this book's available. It's available in ebook and print, not yet audiobook. That's not going to be nearly as long as it was for book one, but it's going to be a few more months. So you can go to my website and order WTF Just Happened. A sciencey skeptic investigates even more evidence of an afterlife and fights for justice with her dead dog.
If a child has an experience and parents are not knowledgeable about it, they can be very confused and uncertain and inadvertently respond in unhelpful ways. If parents have it, like there was a guy who had an NDE, and after his NDE, he couldn't watch TV anymore because there's so much violence and negativity, and he was just too sensitive, and it was just too upsetting. Well, his family used to every night get together and watch TV together. So suddenly he's not able to do this family bonding thing, and it disrupts the whole family system. So there are these social repercussions in people's lives. But the good news is that after an average of about 7 years, it takes a while, people tend to integrate the experience, and they may have reformed their life in some way. They may have changed friend groups because their friends are now like meditators as opposed to going out to the bars every night. And they may have even reformulated their family, family of, especially family of creation. And eventually they say that, there are a lot of challenges to having had a near-death experience, having to integrate and deal with all these changes. And, but they by and large say that it's absolutely worth it to challenges.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds amazing. I would like to have one without ideally I'd like to not get sick, not be in an accident, somehow have one.
Right.
So that was,
they can happen spontaneously as well through meditation practices and things like that, can't they? You don't necessarily have to be in a near-death state.
Yeah, but that's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, I do have a question about that. And then I guess I'll ask first. So is there one case that you've looked into that stands out above all else? I mean, I'm sure a lot are amazing, but is there one that's just amazing? And
yeah, actually, I don't know whether Anita talked about this aspect of her experience when you interviewed her, because it's a kind of a subtle aspect, but to me, it's the most mind bending, and that is that when she was. People can familiarize themselves with her experience through your previous podcast, but when she was with a spiritual entity, and I don't remember who it was, right before she returned to her body, and the spiritual entity conveyed to her that it was time for her to decide whether she was going to stay here or go back into that physical body. And she looked down at that body, and she's like, that body is a mess, and like, I really can go back there. And the spiritual entity is saying yes, and she's saying, well, I said, I don't know, because a nurse was just here taking my blood, and isn't the result of that blood test going to determine whether my physical body lives or dies? And the spiritual entity conveyed to her, no, your decision about whether you're going to live or die physically is going to determine the outcome of the blood test.
And wow.
You get it? Like, how isn't that mind-bending? That our consciousness is, under certain circumstances, or when we have access to its power, it has the ability to influence the material world.
Yeah, which I guess split particle experiment shows and spoon bending shows some, but that's another level, because she was stage 4 terminal cancer at the last stages.
Right.
So I guess this leaves, which it's a little philosophical. I know you probably won't have a factual answer, and obviously people are going to have some sensitive emotions about that. Does that mean does everybody have a choice? Did our loved ones choose to leave us? I assume someone who is 100 years old who passed probably doesn't have the choice to come back and live.
Well,
what are your thoughts?
From a scientific perspective, this is kind of hard to answer, because anybody who chose not to come back has not come back to be in one of our research studies, So, but I would say, based on what I know from what we know from near-death experiences, is that about half of people have a choice, and obviously chose to return, and the other half either were tooling along in their NDE, and suddenly, boom, they were just back in their body. There was no choice in the sense that, nobody said, do you want to go back or not? But another subgroup from that group is given a choice. It's hard to know what to say about people who don't come back, and that it does seem like there are some circumstances where the body is so far gone that it would be really impossible for the person to return to life. Like, I remember when I was a high school counselor, and I had a student who was in a car accident with his mother, where he saw her beheaded in the car accident. There's no choice in that matter for her to come back to her physical body. And the other thing is that even people who have a choice, they sometimes, and there are people who don't want to come back, and they're told to return. They're forced to return, so to speak. And but for the people who have a sense that they could go or they could stay, it's entirely up to them. They have a sense that either way, everything will be fine. everything will be perfectly fine. So even when people don't return, there is a sense that according to near-death experiencers, a sense that everything is fine, as devastating as losses are to us in the physical domain, and we have to figure out how to move on in our lives without our loved ones. In the big picture, this big spiritual picture, all is well, and everything is unfolding as it's meant to. So that I'm giving sort of partly what we can extrapolate from science and partly sort of what I've gathered, like my own opinion.
Yeah, thank you. I think that really makes sense. Yeah, I can't see 100-year-old or obviously someone whose body has been so tragically harmed in an accident. You can't live that way.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned and talked about how some people have types of NDEs through meditation, no illness, no danger to their body. Have you noticed a difference in strength or power of NDE in a meditation versus an accident or illness?
Mm-hmm. Well, and actually I can speak not from what I've noticed, but from what research actually shows. And that is that there is no difference in the nature or strength of the experience or in the after effects. That these experiences seem to be psychospiritually equivalent. It's just that I think what again, now I'm getting into the realm of my opinion. I think the reason these things happen under extreme circumstances is that when we're in these extremes, it's like our consciousness gets sort of loosened from its connection to our physical body. And we open ourselves to our consciousness functioning apart from our physical body. It really doesn't matter what the mechanism is or the circumstances in which the experience happens. It does tend to be the same in nature and in after effects. And it's just, I think the reason that we have so many more reports of people who survived a close brush with death is that that's the most reliable way to loosen that connection between our consciousness and our.
So I suppose to come to a more kind of practical side of this, there will of course be those who say, come on, we know that human beings are frightened of death. All this kind of thing is going to be either our body's way of protecting ourselves, our emotional way of dealing with the finality of death. How can we trust the perceptions of a brain that's dying as opposed to one where we know that a living brain's already very suggestible? What kind of physical material explanations have been put forward, and what are the counters to them?
Well, I would say, too, the theory that people have these experiences because they're afraid of death and they're creating some kind of mental thing to soothe themselves. One question is, why doesn't everybody have one then? Because fear of death is pervasive among humans, and yet 80 to 90% of people who survive close brushes with death don't have a near-death experience. But the bigger question is trying to explain why these experiences occur in any way, whether it's a physical explanation, like there's, lack of oxygen to the brain, which, by the way, research has shown not to be the case. In fact, research has shown a lot of these not to be the case. There's high carbon dioxide level, or there's release of some, yes, right, at death, or whether it's a psychological explanation, like it comes out of fear of death and all that. All of these theories are brought into question with the phenomenon of veridical perception. If people are perceiving things that are impossible to have perceived from the vantage point of where their physical body was, impossible to have rationally predicted, and yet are accurate. It just indicates that at least those experiences were more than subjectively real. They had elements of objective reality, and it suggests then that those experiences that don't have veridical aspects, maybe they don't differ from the other experiences, so they seem to be just as real as the veridical ones.
What kind of opposition do you get when you bring up those kind of cases that do bring objective information?
That I think is the most difficult to counter is the claim that the experiencer somehow got the information before, during, or after the near-death event. And so for example, one of my favorite ones is a woman who's in surgery. She unexpectedly flatlines, and then they manage to resuscitate her after a few minutes. Of course, she never regains consciousness during this. She's completely anesthetized. Her eyes are taped shut, all the things that happen during full anesthesia and surgery. And so they finish the surgery. She goes into post-op. She regains consciousness. Her surgeon comes to visit her and see how she's doing. She says, "I know that I died during the surgery." And he's sort of taken aback. And how do you know that? And she said, "Well, I was up above the ceiling watching as you did this, and then this person did that, and then somebody came in who hadn't been in the surgery and did this stuff and then left before the surgery was finished." And everything that the patient described, the surgeon said was exactly accurate to what he remembered having happened. And she said, and besides that, she said, like I said, I was above the ceiling and I could see through the ceiling, and I could also see through the adjacent walls. And I saw that in the next operating room, they were amputating a man's leg. And when they finished the amputation, they put the leg in a bright yellow plastic bag to dispose of it. And the surgeon is, again, well, this time he's just kind of perplexed, because he says, I don't know what's going on in the other operating rooms. But at this point, it's a few hours later, a few hours have transpired. So he goes back to the hospital records, and he finds that, in fact, in the operating room next to him, while he was doing the surgery on this woman, they were amputating a man's leg. Now, he had never been in that operating room because it was specialized for amputations, and that's not what he did. But at this time that he was looking it up in the records, the room was empty. So he just went to the room and backed in and peeked inside, and there he saw the yellow plastic bags they used to dispose of amputated body parts. Now, if you think that nurses are somehow walking around and saying within earshot of patients, "Oh, we amputated a man's leg today and put it in a yellow plastic bag to dispose of it," I mean, just how likely is that? And so the claim that people got this information somehow. There's another one where a man I believe it was during cardiac arrest, but I don't remember the exact, but he was in the hospital and very ill. And he left his body, he rose up, and he saw, he actually rose up through the floors of the hospital, and right above, in the next floor, he saw these, what he called like models and machinery and things and he couldn't make sense of it. But after his NDE and he regained consciousness and he was telling a nurse about this, she was just amazed, because right above them was their training facility where they had mannequins and machinery and things for training nurses, which is what he saw. Now, again, do you think that nurses are walking around saying, so I was upstairs in the floor right above us, and working on this mannequin, trying to do CPR on it or something, the probability that people learn this information some other way, and they never remember that it ever came from like overhearing a conversation or something. That's really weird. You would think at least one or two people would say, well, I don't know, I overheard these people. But these are all people who don't remember ever hearing it. They remember perceiving it directly during their near-death experience. So that's, I would say, the biggest challenge to veridical perception is people who claim that the person must have somehow learned this information through normal means, when if you read the actual cases, that explanation is really hard to hold water.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And I love that. And I guess I have a question, and I don't know how answerable this will be, but if this is a fact and what happens as we go to the next dimension, state of consciousness, why do only 10% of people have NDEs? Because if it's real, wouldn't everybody?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And we, as you said, it's not really answerable from scientific research, because, we can't know why some people, what we do know from research is that we have found no difference between the 80 to 90% of people who don't remember anything after close brush with death and the 10 to 20% of people who do remember a near-death experience. No difference between them. To make it further complicated, among all the people who have a near-death experience, about 90% of the experiences are dominated by pleasurable feelings, peace, joy, love, and ecstasy, and so forth. And about 10% are distressing. They're dominated by distressing feelings like confusion, terror, horror, something like that. And we have found no difference between those. So this is where my answer is not a scientific answer. It's a heaven only knows answer. Heaven only knows why some people and not others. There have been some theories, and probably the one that I think carries the most weight, but again it doesn't seem to fit every single situation that we can, as far as we can tell, is the possibility that some people need the experience for their spiritual development, and others may not, or others may be so entrenched in material existence that even an experience like this would actually be more disruptive than helpful to them in spiritual advancement. So that's a possibility, but it's purely speculation.
There's another factor that has to be taken into consideration in essence of the circumstance that the NDE takes part in. If they're under heavy sedation, for instance, a lot of sedative drugs include amnesic properties. So how can we tell the difference between someone who did have an experience but don't remember it and someone that just didn't have an experience? Because experientially they'd be exactly the same. And we don't know how the filtration of the brain is working, whether that memory is blocked on psychological grounds or whether there are intrusive drugs that are taking amnesic effects. It is very much up in the air.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a really good point, Darren, because there is research indicating that on people who survived cardiac arrest, there's a tendency for people to remember NDEs more if there were fewer drugs involved. So the drugs do seem to interfere. And as you said, it is standard practice now, whenever somebody gets full anesthesia, that they get an amnesic drug so that they won't remember anything. Because there is this very rare phenomenon of surgical memory
awareness.
Anesthesia awareness. Thank you very much.
Oh,
and just in case that's going to happen, they just don't want it to happen. It's the result of not actually having enough anesthetic, and the person temporarily comes out of, from anesthesia, and they may be in severe pain. And so they're given, that's why they give it routinely now, so that they just want to make sure that people don't remember any pain.
And yeah, that all makes sense. And then we don't know, I mean, apparently research seems to show our brains don't store a lot of, other dimensional memories of, past lives, or, Dr. Tucker's research. Mm-hmm. But we don't know. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I guess one thing I always wonder, and again, getting a little speculative, do you think as time goes on, this is going to be something more and more of us experience as medicine improves and we're able to bring people back from further away? Is this going to become more of a normal part of our society?
I don't know, because what we were just talking about, using amnesic drugs during surgery and things like that mitigates against people remembering. I do wonder whether, there's new research, or relatively new, about the use of psychedelics and how they facilitate similar experiences, similar after effects, and that people it may become more common in our culture for people to seek those experiences and have awakenings from that particular circumstance. But I don't know.
Yeah. And again, getting a touch philosophical, maybe more than scientific. One thing I wonder, so if this is all embedded in who we are, in our experience, we're going back and seeing our loved ones, why do you think we don't remember that in so many ways here? Not only logically, we innately don't remember it, and that death is our biggest fear. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. Well, I do want to be clear that this is definitely speculation, and I've certainly thought a lot about this question, like, why are we put in this physical realm, and our memory of who we really are is erased, and that sort of thing. And I one thing that I've thought is that it's kind of like going to school. When I'm in school, when I was in third grade, I needed to be there and focused on that, not thinking about, my past lives and that sort of thing. It's like a way of putting blinders on that help us to be focused on this lifetime. What near-death experiencers say is that we are here for a purpose, and the purpose is to advance in our capacity to love. And so in order to fulfill that purpose, we need to have those blinders so that we're focused on this lifetime, our decisions from moment to moment in this life and in this lifetime, and not be distracted, by extraneous information, and to kind of say the other side of it is that a lot of near-death experiencers feel chronic longing. They long to return to the joy and bliss that they felt in their near-death experience. And it makes physical existence somewhat torturous for them. They wouldn't end their life in the vast majority of cases. They would never dream of ending their life to get there sooner, because they know their life has purpose. They're here for a reason. But it's not easy to live this life with all of its pain and suffering and know that something awaits that is free of all that. And so in a way, it's a blessing that we forget, so that we can live. And I think that our fear of death is just to help us stay physically alive. And in a roundabout way, that's meeting purpose. So that's as far as I've been able to think on that subject.
I can kind of personally attest to that sense of depression as well, I suppose, because a lot of my suicidal, when I was suicidal with depression, a lot of those feelings stem from that feeling of being incredibly restricted. Imagining that there could be something so much more with infinite possibility, infinite creative potential, and yet I'm stuck here, in this physical body.
Yeah.
That kind of feeling contributed quite considerably to my suicidal tendency. So I can imagine once you've had a glimpse of that. I mean, I've never had a near-death experience, but I can imagine how much more wonderful that would be. So to have actually been there, I can imagine what a torment that must be on your mind.
Yeah, exactly. And it has to be balanced or like outweighed by a sense that despite all that, we're here for a reason. And and another thing NDEers say is that we're here to enjoy life. Like I can let go of material things, but I enjoy getting dressed in the morning and putting on an outfit that is color coordinated and, that sort of thing. We're meant to enjoy what we have and also to be of service to our fellow humans and other creatures and the earth. And so living, learning, and serving are an opportunity that we have in physical existence that we don't have in spiritual existence in the same way. Mm-hmm. So being really able to appreciate that, yeah.
I think that's kind of a beautiful way to end. It's officially an hour, and I know that's all we've asked of your time. Unless, Darren, do you have a final question, or
No,
Dr. Holden? Is there?
I'm good.
Yeah, I just think that's such a beautiful ending too, and perfectly landed on the hour exactly. Unless, Dr. Holden, is there anything else you want to add, or?
No, I think I agree with you. I think the whole purpose of studying near-death experiences, their after effects, and all that is for us here to answer the question of what then shall we do in this life based on what we know and it does boil down to the things we just mentioned: loving, learning, serving. That's what we're here for, so that's kind of the ultimate purpose of all of our research endeavors.
Well, thank you so much. And where can our listeners find you?
Well, I do have a website, janholden.com, and I'm president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, so people can reach me through there as well. I think one of those two places would work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Hi, everyone. So, major exciting news. Book number 1,
WTF Just Happened. A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife,
is now available in audiobook. You can get it through my website or on Apple Books and on Audible. I read it myself, which was a really intense learning experience as well as emotional, as I relived a lot of memories. But for those of you who want to hear even more of my voice for some reason, or also are like me and prefer audiobooks, you can now listen to it. And what's also fun is some of the people read themselves. So you can go to my website, wtfjusthappened.net, where I link to Audible and Apple Books, or you can go directly to Amazon to get it on Audible or Apple Books to get it there. And I hope you enjoy it. And as always, let me know any feedback. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to wtfjusthappened.net. There you can order my book,
WTF Just Happened, a sciencey skeptic explores grief, healing, and evidence of an afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?